Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us for Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. UTEP professor and author Dr. Jonna Perrillo examines the history of how children of Nazi scientists were educated in El Paso and compares that education to that received by Mexican-American children who were already in the community. Dr. Perrillo's book, Educating the Enemy, Teaching Nazis and Mexicans in the Cold War Borderlands, which has been awarded the Southwestern Book Award by the Border Regional Library Association and the Bolton-Cutter Prize from the Western History Association. And then later we'll take a trip down memory lane with another important part of El Paso history, its famous streetcars, which began operating again just a few years ago after being stored in the desert for decades after service ended in the mid-1970s. First, we welcome Dr. Jonna Perrillo, UTEP professor and director of the English Education Program to KRWG Public Media. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Casey.
I think it's important to start with how these children came to El Paso in the first place.
Sure. So about 144 children came to El Paso, the children of Nazi scientists, rocket scientists more specifically. So their fathers were part of the team that created the V2 for the Third Reich. And they came here as part of a briefly covert military operation called Operation Paperclip, which was a joint effort between the War Department and the U.S. military to have these scientists at the end of World War II come to the United States to create a similar missile for the United States Army. And Fort Bliss in El Paso was chosen as the site for them to go.
Tell us a little bit about what kind of environment they lived in.
So they lived on base, the entire families did. So the scientists came over first, and the children and their mothers came over second, starting in early 1947. And they lived in a part of base section off for them, retired hospital barracks that were surrounded by barbed wire. The children were bused to El Paso public schools by military police every day for 3 or 4 years until the entire group moved en masse to Huntsville, Alabama.
So let's talk about their experience while they were in El Paso. Did they attend schools just as any other child in El Paso would, based on where they lived?
Sort of. They attended schools based on what other white children would have done in El Paso. So there were no schools at Fort Bliss at the time. So the fact that they were bused off of Fort Bliss to attend public school was necessary. But then they were assigned to schools that in the parlance of the day were called American schools, which meant that they were attended by Anglo El Paso children. Other schools in the city, over half, and schools that served over half of the El Paso school population that served Mexican American children were called Mexican schools. So their experience in schools in terms of their assignments was partially typical.
We'll get back to that, of course, in the course of our conversation. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of schools and the role that the schools play in citizenship.
So I'm really interested in the ways in which schools create a sense of social citizenship, right? That train students to prepare for whatever role they're expected to play in the American democratic project or democracy. So these children of Nazi scientists coming to American schools was incredibly important for El Paso schools to prove that they could democratize anyone, even the children of fascists. And so there was a huge media campaign around them to show that, in fact, the children were democratizing and that the schools were doing their work in this project.
Meanwhile, across town, maybe in the Mexican schools, as you referred to them earlier, what was that experience like for those children?
It was radically different. So people who know El Paso know probably or can imagine that much of the Mexican American population at this time was segregated to South El Paso. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is the ways in which this wasn't just purely geographic or the way in which we call de facto segregation. There were all sorts of policies that assigned Mexican American children to schools in South El Paso. And these schools were radically different than the schools that white children attended. They were far more crowded. In many schools, there were children taking classes in hallways or auditoriums that were partitioned into multiple classrooms because there simply wasn't enough space for the number of children that were zoned to those schools. They often lacked cafeterias and libraries, so they often lacked the services that were associated with those kinds of school spaces. And they had children who were almost entirely white, many of whom spoke no Spanish, and who had the least sort of say in where they were assigned. They weren't considered choice assignments, these schools, and so oftentimes the teachers who were teaching there didn't really want to be there. But whether they did or not, I can't really go back and record intentions. The policies in these schools affected teachers and students far differently than the policies that operated in Anglo schools.
You indicated that many of them didn't speak Spanish, and in many cases the children hadn't been educated in English, correct? And many spoke Spanish exclusively, right?
Yeah, their entire lives were segregated at this point, many of these children. And we're not talking about middle-class Mexican Americans who could sometimes break out of the segregated system. We're talking about the majority of Mexican American children in the city at the time who were working class. And so, yeah, they came to school speaking very little to no English because their entire lives were sort of circumscribed to South El Paso. And so one of the policies, for example, that I was just referring to is that teachers were allowed to beat assigned demerits to put in closets children for speaking Spanish in school. Speaking Spanish in school is prohibited, even on the playground, even as the almost all of the children spoke almost no English, and almost all of the teachers spoke very little to no Spanish.
I think if you grew up in the area, you know some people from that generation whose parents really discouraged their children from speaking Spanish at all, and many lost the language, and it's so tragic that they could have grown up to be bilingual, but for the right reasons, their parents discouraged them from speaking Spanish at all.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I knew as I was writing the book, but as I've done talks about it in the area, this is very common. That comes up in my talks as this sort of sense of trauma in many ways that this experience represented both for the students and for their extended families who felt equally marginalized by the schools and unwelcome. And parents responded in all different ways, but one very common response is the one that you're talking about, which is to sort of embrace English only to the degree that they could as a family, or to certainly encourage their children to do so. And so, yeah, that's been a very difficult thing for a lot of people in El Paso to deal with.
What did you do research on first? The experience of the German children that came here as part of Operation Paperclip, or the experience that the Mexican American students were having?
I really came to the project through the Paperclip children, through some photos that I found of them. And really the school that the great majority of them attended, Crockett Elementary, is within walking distance of my house, it's down the block. And so I was just intrigued as an education historian immediately by this highly unique and easily salacious but very interesting story.
Well,
and so,
having grown up, born and raised in El Paso, and having gone to many schools throughout Central and East El Paso and even the Lower Valley, to see a picture of a classroom, any classroom in El Paso, of all white children, just kind of makes your jaw drop a little bit.
Yes, it does, although it wasn't hard for them to capture. And actually, these photos were of the children on the playground, and the captions beneath them were something like, which children are German, which are American, you can hardly tell. And so it really showed to me the way in which the press was doing a whole lot of work for the schools and the military to argue that these children are effortlessly democratic, right? Are almost natural citizens in the making. But of course, the children who weren't in those pictures were the majority of the school population, the Mexican American children, who could not have attended those schools.
So what types of research did you do to gather materials for your book?
I did a lot of archival research, including here at NMSU. Your library, your special collections actually has the papers of one of these scientists, Ernst Steinhoff. But I did a lot. I did spend about a month out at the National Archives. The archives were spread out geographically, but I ended up doing a fair amount of oral histories, particularly with the paperclip children, because there were deep gaps in the archives, largely because they were children. It wasn't hard to find out a lot about their parents, but that isn't what I was interested in this project. And children tend to be erased in the archives, period, or often have adults speaking for them, or their voices are mediated through adults. So I felt like I needed to speak to them directly. I did interview some Mexican Americans as well, but at UTEP we have a really amazing oral history archive that I could call on, and that ended up providing me with a lot of what I needed.
And you also conducted some interviews. How did you go about finding people to talk to?
Yeah, so these interviews with the paperclip children, I had a roster that was given to me by the Museum of Space History in Alamogordo. I tracked down as many of those people as I could, just old-fashioned in Google, which was easier to do with the men and the women who tend to change their names. But I just wrote old-fashioned letters to them, snail mail, sent it out to them at the best address I could find. Heard back from a good number of them, some of them who didn't want to interview but responded to me nevertheless. But I ended up interviewing about 20 people altogether. And what was amazing about those interviews was, first of all, the kind of information they could provide that isn't recorded anywhere. But secondly, in some of those relationships I was able to develop with them, the photos in the book, so many of them come from those people, like things that are not in archives anywhere, that are just in people's personal collections. Those I was really grateful for, not just as interesting images, what they are, but they really helped me to understand parts of the story that were hard to document in other ways.
So I want to get back to disparities that you found in education. Obviously these children were, I'm assuming, German-speaking children. So how were they taught English versus how children already here were taught English?
Right, so that's such an important question, radically differently. Right, so they were never beaten for speaking German in school. Instead, by contrast, they were given ice cream and other kinds of rewards at the end of a session for speaking English, right? So it was very much a sort of positive kind of language acquisition education rather than a negative one. And they were very much like the Mexican American children in the sense of their mothers in particular often spoke no English. Many of the scientists themselves, even though they were very well educated, did not speak a whole lot of English. So they were also living in these homes where a foreign language was the predominant language, but their experience in school was radically different. And from what the teachers and their parents testified, they learned English very, very quickly in this system.
Do you think there are legacies of that disparity that exist today?
Well, I think my interest in the paperclip children was about what they revealed about the schools into which they attended, right? So this is in some ways about Anglo privilege, white supremacy more largely. And I do think we're still dealing with inequities. They look quite different. And so in El Paso, when we talk about school inequity right now, we're not talking about racial segregation the way we were. But we are frequently talking about economic segregation. There are schools that are just far better off. The communities that the children come from and their parents are far better off than other schools. And oftentimes they get more privileges, better kinds of programs, better kinds of resources as a result. And this isn't just an El Paso story. This is true across the nation, but El Paso is the school system that I serve as an English educator, that my own children attend. So, I tell the story through a system that I know very well, but, it's important to understand that most school systems work this way.
I think we hear the word indoctrination a lot these days when we talk about our schools and how politicized education has become. What is your concept of indoctrination as it happens and maybe has historically happened in schools?
Well, I'm a little uncomfortable with that term because I think it is used far too casually and actually doesn't reflect reality. Even in this time, even in the midst of the Cold War, which was taking in these children precisely to make an argument about American democracy. It was a deeply political project. I'm not comfortable using the term indoctrination. They were given opportunities that other children were not given, and they were told things about themselves and what they could expect to sort of possess and experience as white children that other children were not told. But I'm still not comfortable with the term indoctrination, which sort of suggests brainwashing, right? That suggests something far more explicit than I think was actually true. A lot of these lessons were learned quite implicitly.
Well, I think we hear it in terms of removing certain things from curriculum. Obviously, we can jump into book bans.
Yeah.
As we're seeing them happen today. Legislatures all over the country are taking on this issue, and they're calling it kind of a battle against indoctrination. Where do you see us a year from now when it comes to this issue?
Well, I'm not sure where we're going to be in a year from now. It's definitely a really challenging time. It's a disheartening time. All of my students are teachers or pre-service teachers. They feel belabored by it, beleaguered by it. Really just, it adds more sort of challenge and distraction from a project that's already difficult post-pandemic. And then, it's just a fiction. When we talk about these book bans, it's really a fiction in terms of this argument about what schools are doing or what English or humanities teachers want to be doing. And so that's really hard to sort of fight against something that isn't true in the experiences of the teachers and students I work with.
When you say it's a fiction, quantify that for us. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think a lot of these books, first of all, teachers are not trying to indoctrinate their students. A lot of these books that are being banned aren't being taught, right? So being on a library shelf, even being in a classroom library shelf and being taught in the classroom are two different things. If you look at the list, they're not books that teachers are often teaching. Graphic novels are too expensive to buy class sets. Just the presence of them being there, right, is the thing that's setting off these book bans. And in fact, testing has often killed the humanities curriculum as it is. No one's reading as much as they should be. Teachers are really fighting for the right to teach novels, period. And that's not about ideology, it's about testing and standardization. So I think there are a lot of threats to our education system right now. I don't think literature is one of them.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the previous book that you authored, Uncivil Rights, Teachers' Unions, and the Battle for School Equity. We just have a couple of minutes left, but obviously we've been talking for the last couple of minutes about a lot that might fit under that umbrella. What is the message of that book?
Well, in Uncivil Rights, I'm really looking at New York City teachers' role in both aiding and pushing back against civil rights movements across the 20th century by African American New Yorkers. And so the story really is, in brief, at first they were helpful. At first they fought for African American students' rights and curriculum, and when it got to a point where it became difficult for them to support those campaigns, for example, when African American parents said, we want more African American teachers, and the almost entirely white teaching body wasn't in favor of that, they really made it quite difficult and were obstructive. And viewers who might be familiar with the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teacher strikes, which were on national news every night because they shut down the New York City public schools for most of a semester, that was a result of that kind of feeling of threat, that students' rights and teachers' rights were at odds with each other.
And it seems like we still have so many things that folks are at odds against. What do you think is the biggest challenge right now facing teachers across the board in our schools?
Well, I think there are two. I think they are dealing with post-pandemic issues, particularly with our youngest students who have spent way too much time on screens as very young children and aren't socialized, don't come to them like properly socialized to be students in a lot of ways, and this is setting them back. But I think the culture wars is the other big thing, right? And just the sort of attack on public schooling and democratic education in this country, in red states in this country, more largely. It's an incredibly difficult environment in which to work. There are so many distractions for them. It's pushed a lot of teachers out of the classroom, and that's very difficult.
Are you working on your next project already?
I've started working on a project which is going to be about the history of young adult literature told through teens' readings of 5 different books over time.
All right, well, we look forward to it, and I hope you'll come back and share some of your findings with us when you get that project under your belt.
Thank you, I'd love to.
Dr. Jonna Perrillo, UTEP professor and director of the English Education Program and author, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks to you, Casey.
And now we relive another part of El Paso history, one that is more well-known, and that's the trolley cars that were a popular mode of transportation from the early 1900s until the mid-1970s. A few years ago, the streetcars were refurbished and resumed service downtown. Let's take a ride, thanks to producer Ralph Escandon.
These are the original streetcars that ran here on the streets of El Paso up until 1974. And they were built for San Diego. The cars were put out of service after World War II, and then they were purchased by the El Paso City Lines, and that was in 1950. After service ended in 1974, the cars were stored out in the desert. When the decision was made to go ahead and bring streetcar service back to El Paso, a consultant was brought in and a contract was awarded to the Brookville Equipment Company of Brookville, Pennsylvania to do the rehabilitation on these cars. The idea for bringing back these streetcars was part of a project that was driven by several people. And then later on, in fact, the city council member Peter Schwartzbein was instrumental in pushing what's known as the Trans-Border Project. There were a number of politicians that worked to gain the funds that would do this, and actually the money to do this came from the state of Texas directly. So the funding to create this project wasn't a burden that was placed on the city of El Paso. I like to think that this was a gift, if you will, to the city of El Paso to use to not only bring positive notoriety back, but certainly install a sense of pride in bringing back history. There was actually 9 streetcars total that were available to the project. And so 6 cars were chosen. Of the 6, right now we have 5 on site, and of the 5, 4 are running because we like to keep a spare in case we have a situation where you have to take a car out of service. There's a couple more cars left over that could very well possibly go through the rehabilitation process. There is a discussion about extending the streetcar line east towards where the medical hospitals are. But there have been discussions with perhaps trying, at least looking really deep into extending the route back across the Rio Grande into Juarez. Let me talk about the initial public response going all the way back to while we were just testing, and it was uniformly positive all the way around. The question that I always got, right, before we went into service, are the cars going to look the same? Are they going to act the same? Because when I was a little guy or a little girl, my father, my mom, my uncle, my grandfather took me on the streetcar to Juarez or from Juarez to here, and it was wonderful to consider the fact that we're bringing something like this back, which brings a sense of pride and history back to the region. If you have any questions about the Sun Metro fares and routes, you can go online to the Sun Metro website. There's a lot of information available, including a section that focuses directly on not only the Brio, which is our bus rapid transit system, but the streetcar as well. The amenities on the streetcar to bring it into the 21st century, Wi-Fi, for example, GPS, an AVL system or automatic vehicle locating system so we can manage the headway between the streetcars. The cars are now ADA compliant. One of the really nifty engineering feats that Brookville pulled off was to integrate a wheelchair lift into the existing chassis. Also, the cars are retaining the same seating arrangements as they are before, but now the seats are leather. And the inside of the car is almost 100% Art Deco. It's beautiful.
Originally, I'm from New England. I'm from the Boston area, but I've lived in El Paso most of my life. I would definitely recommend riding the streetcar or the trolley because it is less stressful than riding the bus. It's very convenient. It's a smooth ride, and it's just a pleasure to, relax on the streetcar. If you're not in a hurry, I think the streetcar is the way to go.
As you ride, enjoy it, and make sure you make it available for other people to enjoy as well.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7 p.m. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.